UFC's probably about as legit as the WWE nowadays. It ain't about the best versus the best no more. It's about Dana's politics.
Fans themselves don't give a fuck about this fight. We don't care one bit, dude.
Since 2024, the UFC's been making, on the regular, undeserved title fights, and this is yet another one.
November 27th, 2025. Dana White has just gone live on Instagram to announce the first cards the UFC will put on for 2026.
Thanksgiving, gang. Fire off some stuff here before we really get into it.
It is one of the biggest announcements yet, as they will be the first cards under the new media rights deal with the entertainment conglomerate Paramount.
The new home for the world's largest mixed martial arts organization.
Paramount Plus will be the new exclusive home for the UFC. It's the start of a
7-year deal worth nearly $8 billion.
These cards need to do well, or the deal will start off on a bad note. The first headliner of the year is Justin Gaethje versus Paddy Pimblett, with Gaethje being one of the most ruthless fighters with no boring fights, and Paddy Pimblett being a rising star in the lightweight division. The UFC thought this would get fans excited, but fan sentiment is quite different. UFC is an actual joke. The fights nobody asked for. Some of the worst matchmaking you will ever see. The next card the following week, headlined by Volkanovski versus Lopes, gets even worse reactions.
This disgusts me. This is disgraceful.
What does deserve mean? What do the rankings mean? What does a champion even mean? What does a sport mean? It's all ambiguous at this point.
Fans are upset since the #1 contender of the lightweight division, Arman Tsarukyan, has just been passed up again for a shot at the lightweight title. Additionally, Diego Lopes, who just came short in an opportunity to gain the featherweight throne, has just been given a second chance immediately, even though there are multiple contenders that haven't even got a chance. But what the fans don't know is that the UFC has made their statement on what the organization is really about. The goal they are striving for and the value proposition they pride themselves on has just been taken to a whole new level. A transformation from a league to find the best fighter in the world to a company that wants to entertain the masses. But this transformation didn't just happen overnight. It has slowly been taking effect since the UFC's inception back in 1993. A history of brutality, governmental regulation, bankruptcy, and favoritism. This is the history of how the UFC turned from a league trying to find the ultimate fighting champion to an entertainment company with the goal of global viewership domination.
Dana White, president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Dana, congratulations on your first show. That's gotta feel good.
Thank you very much, James. I appreciate it. We're very excited.
November 12th, 1993. The first UFC event, called The Beginning, takes place in Denver, Colorado. It's an out-of-the-box spectacle and is labeled as no holds barred.
8 of the deadliest fighters in the world will meet in a no-holds-barred combat. No rules, no judges' scores, and no time limits.
By the end, the jiu-jitsu representative, Royce Gracie, wins the championship by submitting 3 fighters in a row. It amasses 86,000 pay-per-views on its first event and is successful enough to continue putting on more. Its it factor is straight-up violence, a level of fighting and brutality never before seen on TV. Although many found a fascination with this new spectacle, the US government had something else to say.
It's a brutal sport, no doubt. Arizona Senator John McCain to ban ultimate fighting.
It's 1996. Senator John McCain watches a tape of the first UFC events. He finds it deplorable, labeling it human cockfighting, and goes on a personal crusade to stop it. He sends letters to the governors of all 50 US states, requesting that they ban the UFC from holding events in their territory. As chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, he pressures cable providers to drop the UFC from their pay-per-view lineups. His plan works, and is able to get the UFC banned in 36 states, with major cable networks removing it from their programs. With the harsh restrictions now in place, the UFC struggles to stay afloat.
I got into a huge battle with the old owner of the UFC named Bob Meyerowitz, who's from New York. And he flips out at me one day and says, you know what? There is no more money. I don't even know if I have enough money to put on one more event.
In a last-ditch effort to save the company from bankruptcy, they adopt the Unified Rules of Mixed Martial Arts, a rule set that introduces weight classes, judging criteria, safety regulations, and more. They adopt this rule set to seek legitimacy and get sanctioned in states so that they can return to pay-per-view and get revenue pumping again. They would then go through the most pivotal shift in their management structure that would end up changing the trajectory of their company by leaps and bounds. In 2001, Dana White, along with the Fertitta brothers, acquired the UFC and used their connections to get sanctioned in Nevada. They start putting on televised events in whatever venues that will take them, such as the Trump Taj Mahal. By 2004, no matter how hard they try, the UFC just can't seem to put on high-profile events. They are down $44 million, and the Fertitta brothers are keeping the ship afloat by pouring their personal wealth from their casino businesses into the company. However, they conjure up an idea for one last effort to save the company. It's extremely risky, as it will cost the UFC $10 million extra with no guarantee of any success. However, it would be the catalyst for one of the biggest turnarounds in combat sports business history, and the basis for the UFC's mindset of entertainment over everything. Century City, Los Angeles, California. Dana White is at a conference for the cable television service In Demand. He has tracked down the man in charge of pay-per-view buys for the company, Marshall Zelaznik. White is antsy, as he has tried pitching the UFC's final hope of survival to all major TV networks, with no luck. When Zelaznik comes out, he is shocked to see Dana. At first, he is apprehensive, but eventually comes around to the idea. It's a reality show centered around aspiring mixed martial arts fighters. 16 fighters would live together in a house in Las Vegas, isolated from the outside world. They would be divided into two teams, each led by a famous UFC coach. They would compete in an elimination-style tournament, with the winner earning a six-figure contract with the UFC. To increase their chances of getting picked up, the UFC would cover all production costs, which would amount to a total of $10 million. It works. They get picked up by Spike TV and are put on a Monday night time slot right after WWE Raw. The show is an instant success. With Dana White as the host of the show, his brash "I'll say what I want" attitude brings in attention from viewers. The show also portrays a vulnerable side to the fighters that no one has seen before. The final cherry on top was the finale, where Stephen Bonner and Forrest Griffin put on what many fans say one of the greatest fights of all time. This is where the UFC understood the value of entertainment. If they put on entertaining back and forth brawls, as well as engage the viewers with more personal stories and build-up, viewers would be much more likely to stick around. Throughout the next few years, the UFC would have legendary fighters, each in their own era. The mid-2000s with Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell, and the late 2000s with GSP, Silva, Jones, and Lesnar. These champions had it all. Big enough names to draw in large pay-per-view numbers, with the skill and determination to defend against the top of their division year after year. It was the UFC's golden age, and a time where they broke out of the small niche and into the public eye. However, unbeknownst to everyone, was a fighter that would change the landscape of combat sports forever. Not only would he break multiple pay-per-view records with his fights, he would start the UFC's mindset of pushing down the sport itself for money and viewers. He would knock out opponents faster than anyone before him, go on world tours and sell out arenas in minutes, and skip the line for title shots over deserving contenders.
Notorious Conor McGregor!
August 10th, 2015. Conor McGregor is the UFC interim champion of the featherweight division. He achieved this by beating the hardest stylistic matchup he has gotten up to this point in Chad Mendes. He was supposed to fight for the undisputed title. However, the current champion, Jose Aldo, had pulled out just 11 days before the fight due to a fractured rib. A frustrating turn of events, but it doesn't matter anymore, as it has just been officially announced that the unification bout with Aldo will take place in December. The first round of promotion was at a level that no UFC fighter had ever seen before or since. They invested roughly $7 million on a 12-day tour that would go through 8 of the most major cities in the world, such as Los Angeles, London, and Rio de Janeiro. Although this much effort into one fight would usually be seen as overkill, this one was different. Conor McGregor had already become the biggest star in UFC history before even attaining an undisputed belt. Every time his name was on a UFC event, their numbers and revenue skyrocketed. They knew that McGregor was their key to unprecedented success, and they would need to leverage him as much as possible. But the shenanigans that McGregor would do throughout the next few years would showcase the true priorities of the UFC. After knocking out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds, McGregor sought to become a double champion by beating the lightweight champ Rafael dos Anjos. However, RDA would pull out just 11 days before before the fight from a broken foot. To take his place would be a weed-smoking, no-nonsense man from Stockton, California. That would be 2 weight classes above McGregor's. In one of the most shocking turns of events in UFC history, Nate Diaz would end up submitting a gassed-out McGregor in round 2. Embarrassed and seeking revenge, McGregor would call for the immediate rematch. At first, the UFC resisted, but eventually gave in to the demands and announced the rematch that would take place on August 20th, 2016. Public sentiment on this decision was split. One side argued that McGregor was getting blatant favoritism from the UFC. Throughout all of this, he was able to keep his 145-pound belt without ever having to defend or acknowledge the featherweight division. The other side, which included McGregor's fans and Dana White, stated that since McGregor had been the most reliable fighter for them and stepped up on multiple occasions, they would allow him these exceptions. Although the UFC made it seem like this was the last exception they would give McGregor, that would be far from the truth. Fast forward to June of 2017, and McGregor vs. Mayweather has just been announced. It's only the second time in history that a UFC fighter has ever been allowed to fight outside of the organization, with the first being the appearance of Chuck Liddell in the Pride Grand Prix back in 2003. The reason McGregor was able to do it was, of course, money. Through the UFC's deal with Mayweather's team and Showtime, they end up receiving an estimated $30 to $50 million without having to pay for production or take any risk. However, while all of this is happening, the lightweight division, which McGregor is the current champion of, is at a logjam. To aid with the promotion of the Mayweather fight, the UFC would not take away the lightweight belt from McGregor. This would become one of the longest periods of an undisputed champion not defending their belt. It would eventually take 511 days for the UFC to finally strip the belt from McGregor, which was even longer than the 350 days it took for him to be stripped of his featherweight belt. However, the nail in the coffin was McGregor's return in 2018 to fight the current lightweight champion Khabib Nurmagomedov. Although Conor had technically never lost the belt, he had been inactive for over 2 years. The #1 contender, Tony Ferguson, had a much better resume on paper to fight for the title, as he was the previous interim champion and was on a 12-fight win streak. But the UFC didn't care about the rankings. They went ahead with the McGregor vs. Khabib fight and would put on the highest-grossing pay-per-view in UFC history. It is important to note that Khabib Nurmagomedov vs. Tony Ferguson had already been attempted 4 times before this. However, each would be cancelled due to a last-minute injury or weight cut issue. To the UFC, the risk of scheduling the fight again was nowhere near as enticing as a McGregor super fight. However, with all of these instances stacked up over time, it is clear that the UFC was willing to bend the rules of the company and diminish the rankings in order to let their best entertainer bring in the money. One would reasonably think that the UFC would bend these rules for only someone as special as McGregor. To be fair, he is the most prolific and entertaining athlete the combat sports world has ever seen. However, the McGregor effect had already shifted the mindset of UFC matchmakers. Not only did it instill favoritism in matchmaking, but it would lead to gimmick belts being created to prop up watered-down fight cards and some of the most egregious, undeserving title fights the sport has ever seen. Once McGregor stopped fighting in the UFC consistently, they had to move on and figure out a way to keep fans entertained as much as possible. Their most interesting attempt was a gimmick belt for fans. On November 2nd, 2019, UFC 244 was set to take place at Madison Square Garden. The intended headline fight was Kamaru Usman vs. Colby Covington. However, the fight would end up falling through due to Covington having disputes with his allocated pay. Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz had set up a fight between each other verbally, after Diaz would call him out in a post-fight interview. The UFC would see an opportunity and use them as the headliner. However, Dana White would get hung up on a certain phrase that Diaz said in his speech, and it would create a new belt with new problems.
The reality was, for me to think about how do we do a main event that isn't a title fight. I think we've done it once with Anderson Silva. I started thinking about the things that Diaz said, kicked around to the guys. What do you think about me doing a BMF belt for this thing? They loved it, and here we are today.
UFC 244 would go on to be a massive success, as it would sell out Madison Square Garden and put on some of the most entertaining performances in UFC history. The only title fight on the card was for the BMF belt, which Jorge Masvidal was the new holder of. Although at first it was a one and done thing, the UFC would go on to promote the belt as a prestigious championship. But the issue with the belt is not in the fact that it exists. The main issue stems from two different reasons, and they expose how it is not a prestigious sports accolade, but a promotional gimmick for entertainment. Here's the list of the BMF holders since its creation in 2019. Each of the holders would win the belt in devastating fashion, with all of them winning by TKO or KO. However, they would all go on to lose their next fight. One would think that since this is a champion losing a fight, they would lose the belt that they represent as well. But in reality, only Justin Gaethje would lose his belt. Not only this, but Masvidal won the belt in the welterweight division. After he retired, the UFC would put up the belt in the lightweight division, showing that the belt was not limited by weight. However, when questioned about why the BMF belt was not on the line for Holloway versus Topuria, Max Holloway would state,
"Could you imagine Islam walking around with 2 belts after knocking out Volk? The belt was in a different weight class for a different reason. If the UFC really wanted to make it happen, they would have put it up, and I don't know why they didn't, but Dana said what he said, so he's the boss man, you know?"
And here arises the first issue. The BMF belt does not have a consistent method of passing down the title. It is only on the line when the title holder wants it to be. This leaves the only real prestige behind the belt as the title holder being a guy that is the toughest, grittiest fighter in the UFC. This also is simply not the case. At the start of round 1 of Topuria versus Holloway, Ilya would beckon Max to join him in the middle of the octagon, signifying that he wanted to swing until someone goes down. Max Holloway, representing the BMF title, theoretically should have been the first person to accept this call-out. However, Holloway would not throw down in the middle and proceeded to fight on the back foot and around the octagon the entire bout. Eventually, he could not escape El Matador. This point is brought up not to tear down Max Holloway. He is a former champion of a real belt and has shown in countless fights that he is a warrior that deserves praise. Although it was the smartest game plan and proved to give Topuria a tough fight, it unfortunately exposed the truth about the BMF belt being illegitimate. It no longer represented the motto, anywhere, anytime, since the title holder, when presented with the toughest opponent he has faced, backed down on the one thing it represents. But the confusion over what is legitimate or sensible in the UFC had started years ago with Conor skipping the line. The UFC stated that this overlooking of the rankings, the strongest indicator of who deserves to fight for a title the most, was only given to him because of his loyalty and, to be quite honest, his star power. But in 2025, the story is much different, where fighters with no extraordinary star power or pull are now getting the same exceptions. On his rise to the top, former champion Sean O'Malley was given what many fighters call Dana White privilege. As a number 11 contender, O'Malley was given a fight against the number 1 contender in the bantamweight division, Petr Yan. Not only was this kind of jump in the rankings unheard of, but it would end in O'Malley winning a controversial decision in a fight many people thought he lost. Then when he became champion, he was given a title defense against the number 5 ranked contender, Chito Vera. Not only was Chito undeserving because of his recent loss to a higher contender, but also because of the other contenders with much better resumes. Once O'Malley actually fought a deserving fighter in Merab Dvalishvili, he got dominated for 5 rounds straight. And somehow, the favoritism would get even worse when O'Malley would get an immediate rematch against Dvalishvili after not having fought a single time since his loss. And now we are here, at the beginning of 2026. The first card of the year is between a retiring fighter that's only recent win is against the current number 9 contender, and a propped up star for the UFC, whose best win is against a number 12 ranked Michael Chandler. Not only that, but he has had some of the most cherry-picked fights to get to this point, and is skipping over Arman Tsarukyan, the fighter with the strongest resume by far in the lightweight division currently. The next card after that is Volkanovski defending his belt against the guy he just defended his belt against. The only way Lopez earned it is by beating number 10 ranked John Silva. The matchmaking from a sports standpoint makes such little sense that even the fighters benefiting from it acknowledge the lack of equity.
Who do you think should fight Volk next for the belt?
I think Lerone is making a great job.
Mobsad deserved for the title, of course.
Little Muffin, two guys undefeated, the both guys deserve for the title, but UFC send me the chance, I'm taking the fight.
All of this has caused outrage from invested MMA fans. So the real question is this: if the UFC's fan base has shown such backlash from their nonsense matchmaking, why are they still doing it? Although the simple answer is money, it really boils down to the goal of the company itself. The UFC's mission when it first started in 1993 was to find the ultimate fighting champion by putting the best fighters against the best. However, now their goal is to put on the most entertaining fights in the world. And if there is one thing for sure, the UFC has definitely achieved this goal. They are anticipated to reach around $1.5 billion in gross revenue by the end of 2025. They just signed a $7.7 billion deal with Paramount for media rights. If you compare the UFC with any other competitor in the MMA space, they are miles ahead in terms of talent, viewership, and entertainment. Where PFL has tried a more meritocratic way of scheduling fights, they have issues with profitability and consistency. Where one focuses on the sport itself by having specialized bouts in MMA, Muay Thai, kickboxing, and more, they too struggle with profitability. The UFC's entertainment-first mindset is what has driven its growth across the world. Fans and investment holders are mad when the most skilled and dominant fighters win a boring decision, and roar with praise and happiness when warriors knock each other out. The UFC has grown to the biggest point in their history, while at the cost of the integrity of the sport they fought so hard to legitimize just 20 years ago. So although you may be frustrated with undeserved title shots or blatant favoritism, the overall casual fan base tunes in more often when these instances occur. Honestly put, there are no other options, so enjoy the show.